It's like New Year's Eve. It's 3 o'clock and we like to be precise. So I would like to welcome you all to this Copenhagen Pride Week 2020 talk on pride as a civic religion. I just want to let everybody in the tent know that this talk is being live streamed, and that means that if you're sitting in front of the camera, you will be on the live stream, and if you're not comfortable with that, you can move to behind the camera, and then you will not be in it. It will be possible during the talk to ask questions. If you have questions, raise your hand, and somebody will come and hold a microphone up for you. And it's also for you who are following this at home. You can ask questions or comment in real time, and then those comments will arrive here on my screen here, and I can ask them on your behalf. But my name is Lars Henriksen. I'm chair of Copenhagen Pride, and I'll be moderating the debate. And with me, I have Sine, Jannick, and Stefan from CBS, Copenhagen Business School, who are conducting research at the moment on the topic pride as a civic religion. And before I say any more, I would like the three of you to just briefly introduce yourselves, and then amongst yourselves also introduce your research project. Who wants to begin? Sine?
Hi, so I'm Sine, a member of the project representing Roskilde University. How daring. And yeah, I'm a professor of strategic communication and participating in this project, focusing on ways in which what we do at Pride also circulate in social media, like today, hopefully, and what that means in terms of the interrelationships between the physical presence in the now and, well, the broader virtual circulation, and how that is preserved, perhaps intensified, and in other ways turned into something else when it meets a virtual world.
And my name is Jannick. I'm a postdoc at Copenhagen Business School. I recently completed my PhD in what I call norm-critical approaches to organizing and researching diversity. In a sentence, studying, exploring the practices of mainly alternative organizations representing LGBTQIA+ people and also other intersections, to learn from them how they go about organizing and make organizational spaces more inclusive, and then see how you can kind of translate that to other types of organizations. And then I'm, as I mentioned, postdoc, but on this project on pride as a public ritual and socially integrative civil religion, and I think this is something we will unfold as we move on.
Here we go. So my name is Stefan Schwarzkopf. I'm also working on this research project. I'm an associate professor at CBS. And my research specialism is to study how liberal democracies need specific things that they hold sacred in order to function. So I'm researching how specific theological concepts, for example, make their way into daily discourse, and how these theological concepts allow us to study, for example, social movements like Pride and help us to understand their public role better. And I think we'll obviously come back to these theological elements in a moment.
Now it's me who turned my microphone off. I apologize. And so I want to actually start with you, Stefan, because we began this talk already in February during Winter Pride, where you had not really begun your research yet. So a part of this will also be asking you about how far has your research brought you on the topic. But I would like you to tell us a little bit about how this idea even came about. And I know that you have a little anecdote that you can share with us on that, the epiphany almost, to stay within a religious framework, that you had during one Pride parade here in Copenhagen.
So back in February, when we had our first conversation with you at Winter Pride, I think we were babies, so we now progressed to, I would say, toddlers. So we started to crawl. Officially, the research project has started on August the 1st, so we're now, 3 weeks old? you can say, institutionally speaking, still crawling. So maybe a few words on how this project actually came about. When I first joined the Pride Parade, this was in 2018. That was just the year after CBS had officially also become a sponsor and fitted its own float. And there was a large group of CBS employees and their families and friends and students, etc., etc., etc. So I decided to also to come along. And on that particular day, I do remember that I was with friends and colleagues in my family waiting for the party to start and for the float to actually move. So there was this anticipation building up, which was already gives you a hint a little bit what a pride parade, when it takes place physically, actually means psychologically. Yeah? The sense of anticipation, the sense of mass, of groups of people around you waiting for something to happen, something special to happen. And as I was standing there and waiting, I was looking around, and behind me was or behind us, CBS, was actually an ambulance that was being used by a non-for-profit organization that supports prostitutes here in the red light. Sex workers in the red light district in cases of violence during the night, etc. And I noticed how these volunteers and these activists were slowly transforming themselves. So there was still early days, it was still around 11 o'clock or something, and people arrived, and slowly people around me started to put on war paint. So putting on little costumes, uniforms. We at CBS, we were actually on the street changing to love suits everyone, right, to look alike. And I was getting my rainbow stamps in the face, and at that moment it just occurred to me how very similar this was to Aboriginal tribes or tribes in the Amazonas or in Africa, literally transforming their normal selves into different selves, into selves that transcend their sense of normality, so that they can take actually part in unusual, out of the ordinary group rituals, such as war dances or rain dances or any other form of religious exercises. And it was really in that moment that it occurred to me that what a famous French sociologist by the name Émile Durkheim described for mass events, when people transcend themselves and become different selves, that I was at that moment right in the midst of it. And this was, as you describe it, as you know, an epiphany moment, and I was beginning to talk to people about it and about their experiences, and this is how it took off, and now we're here after 2 years.
And I do think that for many LGBT-identified people, being likened to a religion can be at least quite surprising, because the relationship between organized religion and LGBT-identified individuals has not always been the most sympathetic one. And now you point to a number of indigenous religions, but I could also point to organized book religions, the priest going into the vestry and putting on his garbs and so on and so forth. Do you want to add to that before I ask more?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and I learn every time we have these debates, also from you telling your anecdote and retelling it, that this notion of religion or concept of religion also provoked me, not least for the reasons that you just mentioned, that while it's not necessarily controversial, also because you have queer communities that actually work at the intersection of religion and different cultures and so on, to show that yes, you can be gay and Muslim at the same time, for instance, then still the way in which much formal religion has been practiced historically and still is by some people is very exclusionary of the LGBTQIA+ community. So it was actually something that provoked me, but then again, when I heard you talk about your epiphany, I could see that, well, Sine and I, we were among the original group of people taking initiative for CBS to start walking the parade back in 2017 under the slogan "Love Suits Everyone." And what we did was in order to celebrate diversity, there was a degree of conformity in that we all had to wear the same clothes and have the rainbow colors and We've even made a dance move and so on and so forth. So I could really start seeing that there is kind of a public ritual. So you start kind of believing through your practice of participating in Pride. So kind of this belief in diversity, in love is love, and the universal human rights. This belief works as an exteriority to yourself, actually, in a sense. So this is one of the things that I've learned already being part of the project.
So I think there's two dimensions to the project that are maybe important to tease out. On the one hand, this notion of the ritual, which of course builds on religious rituals, and we could mention the Easter parade, and we could think of how the carnival, which maybe today we don't think of as a religious event, but used to be, or it came from some of the same traditions. But Pride is not the only public mass event to take on such forms, and also not the only one that we don't necessarily associate with religion. So a soccer game or a music concert or any other sort of event where you dress up in your similar Manchester United outfits or your Rage Against the Machine t-shirt or whatever your personal preference might be. So in that sense, the turning point around the mass ritual and the physical embodiment of that, and how that, on the one hand, may be sort of a transcendence of your daily self, but into something which might be quite particular. So the point is to identify with Pride in that particular sense. On the other hand, what we're working with in the project is the notion of a civic religion, meaning a religion that does not exclude, but is based upon universal principles. And we're thinking of Pride as a manifestation of those universal principles. So this being the human rights program, rather than the LGBTQIA+ rights program, is one sort of specific example of what that universal drive might mean, or how that might become manifested. So I think that's important to include as well.
So just to, for the benefit of everybody here, when we talk about a civic religion, is what you're saying that means, could that be translated into an a-religious religion? Is that what civic religion means? Or what do you mean by that term even?
That's a good question. So I think this goes back to a very profound research problem also in theology, whether there can actually be religions without God. But civil religion is one of those. So civil religion consists of things like uniformity and rituals and commonly shared music and identity systems, identity markers, the common dance moves, etc. But a civil religion, the most prominent example would be the civil religion of the United States. So it's a constructed system of things that are held dear, things that are made untouchable, things you're not supposed to ridicule or take lightly. So for example, if you go, I once visited St. Peter's Church in Rome, and it was like today, a very hot afternoon, and I literally for a second sat down, not with my bottom, but just with my knees, and just to take rest. Within seconds, an usher came along and asked me to stand up, because of course that gesture of sitting down in that particular church at St. Peter's was seen as unacceptable, because the place is sacred, it's a special place. And I saw similar things happen at the George Washington memorial in Washington D.C., where the great man sits on this giant marble chair. So in the United States, the flag, the anthem, George Washington, people, names, symbols, colors have been rendered special, so special that they cannot be sullied, in a sense. So that's what we call a civil religion. So civil religions can have all of the hallmarks of a religion and allow communities to build up that sense of commonality that allows you to, in crucial moments, to transcend yourself, and in the most crucial moment, to give up your life and sacrifice yourself for the good of a greater community. So therefore, you can have actual religions without necessarily discussing theological questions of God, for example.
And how does that differ, this civic religion, how does that differ from a personality cult?
I think, okay, so a personality, that's also an interesting question. So personality cults, what we see in political religions, specifically in the former Eastern Europe, under fascist regimes, those were also political, we call them political religions rather than civil religions, because civil religions typically focus on the status of the individual citizen, the member of a community that is still able, where the person, him or herself, is able to rationally identify him or herself with the community. Whereas a personality cult, these things we've seen with the Tsar, Stalin, Hitler, in a sense erases this and deliberately erases this idea of the self as a citizen, which is of course something that in Western civil religions we try to strengthen because democracies need that. That's the difference.
Yeah, just you could say that maybe in a personality cult, the cult is in the service of the person and hence the principles, whereas in the civic religion, you put yourself as an individual in the service of the universal principles that you believe in. So it's kind of a reverse situation. And also you could say that personality cults tend to be popularist in that sense of sort of exploiting. So rather than forwarding principles of inclusion that we could all thrive with, they exploit those in their own, like for their own benefit.
When you, sorry.
Could I just add something? Civil religion and sacrifice is something that I think binds book religions as well as civil religions. So if you enter Pride Square today, right here, and I hope that the viewers will make their way physically here at some stage, you see on the right-hand side and the left-hand side black and white photographs of contemporary and past activists of the Pride movement. And with at least half of them, you can see the immense sense of personal sacrifice that these people put forward. Sometimes, and quite a few of these examples, they're sacrificing their own life, whereas they could have stayed quiet, out of the limelight, away from activism. Now, the question in sociology, and here we're really purely talking theory, is what is it that allows people to make that extra step, sacrifice themselves for a greater good, a greater movement, yeah, that then has a good outcome for other people? These questions can only be answered if we bring in religious terminology, such as sacrifice, and then the step towards a civil religion is actually quite short, and helps us also understand how pride can develop, or has developed actually, into a civil religion.
And to an extent, maybe we can talk about a gallery of sainthood.
I was reminded of that. Exactly. Civil religions, liberal democracies in the wider sense, but also civil religions as movements. The question is whether they have always historically their own sense, or whether they need them. That's something I would at the moment not want to decide, because if we argue that they need them, that brings in normative aspects that can also be quite controversial to discuss. But they have them.
I felt before, when you described us, the Pride movement, up against other examples of what you said were or came close to civic religions, and likened us to football teams or a carnival, and that I inside myself objected to that somehow. And while, for example, a Hall of Fame would possibly be found in a football club as well, I remember that one of the things that you also talked about in February as being perhaps unique for the Pride movement or the LGBTI+ movement, I don't know, this is part of my question, are we unique in that sense, is the myth of creation, that I'm not sure exists in a football club, or are we unique in that sense that we even have a creational myth around it?
Seems you've never joined a football club.
Huh?
It seems you've never joined.
I've never, no.
But anyway, let me just provide a few other examples. So we could have the Women's March or Black Lives Matter, and they would have similar sort of meetings with the movement centering around a mass collective and an event that, and of course the original or the first pride parades took the same kind of protest, that this is a demonstration. And one of the things that I know you've also talked to people about over the years is this question of what happens to a protest when it turns into a party, which may be the kind of, so we've come so far that today the most ready comparison is that of a party rather than a protest. But, you know, to be fair, examples like Black Lives Matter and the Women's March are equally, that's the type of movement that I was referring to.
But I think the fact that... No, I actually wanted to comment on what Sine just said about having come so far that it's actually closer to a party. I think that's also perhaps what makes us able to talk about Pride, and in particular Pride parades, as a civil religion in the first place. The thing is that it's moved from, not away from though, but from being a protest. It still is a protest movement, but fighting for rights for a particular group of people, LGBTQ plus people, to also being a celebration of what has been achieved historically, especially in places like Copenhagen and Denmark, for instance. And I think that is why it's moved, or how it's been able to move from something particular to something more universal, where you can actually participate in the ritual, regardless if you identify as LGBT plus or not. This also means that, of course, organizations, corporations, and so on, they can kind of bandwagon, and then you have debates of pinkwashing, commercialization, and so on. But it is a kind of mainstreaming that makes the ritual broad, so all people can participate in it.
On the creation myth, I would like actually hear a little bit more from my collaborators on this. Specifically how within the community, within the movement, Stonewall as a place, as an event, is remembered, celebrated, appropriated, falsely remembered, circulated. I would like to hear from both of you about this. But just also following on from what Sine mentioned earlier about the similarities and the football clubs and the foundation myths. It is indeed true that in the United States, baseball clubs and American football clubs have these not just Hall of Fames, but both Manchester United as well as some American NFL football and baseball clubs allow you actually to hold weddings on the sport grounds, so that you have highly dedicated fans where the entire family is in the third generation a Redskins or San Francisco 49ers fans for generations, and then holds civil ceremonies on the grounds. So that tells you that the myth-making...
We have weddings during Pride.
Yeah, exactly. So there's the similarities.
And I think I would highly recommend that everyone goes to Copenhagen Pride Week 2020 DK, because I know that there is a video uploaded, and I can't remember his name.
Well, actually there are three videos on the Stonewall myth. There is sort of the official explanation taken from the History Channel, where it's very much the creation myth as it has developed. Then there is an eyewitness account from a guy named Tree Sequoia, who was there on the 28th of June 1969. He's now 81 years old and still works as a bartender in Stonewall Inn, and almost makes his living of telling people about his experience in it back in the day. It gives extra tips, I suppose. And then there is the sort of the doubter, the person who's actually sat down and investigated Jared Markovich, and who also does tourist guided tours around Greenwich Village and around Stonewall Inn, and points to many of the sort of developments in the story that has come down through the myth, but that do not necessarily have a basis in history or fact.
And I think that video clearly shows that there is definitely a myth. There is also a legacy creation and martyrs and saints. But what is being problematized in that video is really whether it all began, as we usually say, with Stonewall, or if we had protests before that, for instance. And also who threw the first brick, and preoccupation with, and well, an interest in, is it important who threw the first brick? But then you see in popular culture that you make movies that whitewash the history and so on. So it's definitely something that's created and also discussed and negotiated, I think, as part of the civil religion.
Yeah, so I think one of the points about myths is that they're certainly not specific to the Pride movement, that all movements or all collective identities or religions, if you like, have myths as part of sort of a narrative, a story of how we came about as part of what unites us. And if you want to extend the sort of metaphor of the religion, you could say that what we're witnessing now and these various versions of the story is like, do you want to be a fundamentalist? And is it the word specifically that we have to take literally, or is it the meaning? So the final video really says, well, actually none of this is really true, but it doesn't matter because it's still the point that we're here celebrating Pride, and that message of the celebration of Pride is what is carried on, which might be how sort of what we call culturally Christian in Denmark, if that's how you identify yourself, well, that's what you would say. Oh, I don't really believe in the Bible, but I think it's a beautiful message anyhow. So that comparison might even, like, we could push it in that direction as well.
So in that sense, is the myth in itself having a myth that we can all sort of retell more important than fact and truth?
Well, again, this whether it's more important or not is a normative question that, for the moment at least, would like to put aside as a coming from a historical sociology background. The fact is that Pride has a myth, can be observed, and I think this accounts to a large extent also for the success of the movement. The fact that it's universal, but at the same time not placeless and not timeless. So the ritual is tightly bound to a specific sort of what's in very theoretical terms called chronotope. Chronotope means there's a space-time that has to come together to give this movement meaning. And the space is the founder myth of the Stonewall Inn in New York. But also that the last weekend of June, right? The fact that you can link yourself in an entire movement to a place and to a specific time, year after year, and spin a myth around it so that people have memories, shared memories, falsified memories, video, their pictures from people who fought on the other side, from the Metropolitan Police in New York, who then said, well, this is what we were. Stones were pelted at us, and I was just a normal police officer, etc., etc. The fact that it's a chronotope, a space-time, I think, and so it's not so universal that it's placeless. I think accounts for the success. And just to give another anecdote for this last year, when Stonewall celebrated its 50th anniversary in the last week of June, on that evening, I decided to walk down and see if I could see the Stonewall Inn from inside. And of course, I didn't get anywhere near it. There were 50,000 people around it, right? So that tells you a little bit about the importance of this myth. Yeah? So whether it has to be there, it is there and it worked its work, so to speak. Yeah?
And in a way, I mean, it also facilitates things this year when hundreds and hundreds of prides around the world were postponed and cancelled. And the movement, the global movement, decided to come together and do what we call Global Pride, which was a 27-hour-long stream of prides from all over the world, uploading videos, and it ran from the east of the Pacific, where it started in the morning, and then it followed time zones across the world. And the one thing that there was never any discussion about was the date, because it had to run over the 28th and into the 29th of June. And that was never debated. I mean, everything else was up for debate, but not that. So in a way, it may also facilitate collaboration, this universal and chromatope aspect.
And one of the things that for me are like really special and beautiful about this myth is how it's able to contain more and more differences as it sort of keeps unfolding and continues to develop. So you kind of in an aside mentioned whitewashing and the fact that the Pride movement for a long time was very gay and maybe even very male gay and very white, but sort of tapping back into the Stonewall myth or history of it has allowed us to see that, well, it was trans people were involved and black people, people of color were involved, were very central to those specific events. So in that sense, the story has turned out to have some hidden value that perhaps has been sort of covered up for a while, but are now making these facts are now sort of re-entering the stage and retelling the story in that light. I think is one of the reasons it's still so relevant and keeps sort of giving back to the community that it's helped create.
Is part of your research also on, let's say, the consequences for the Pride movement of being, if that is so, of being a civic religion?
I would like definitely also to hand this over to our postdoc here in the middle. But yes, this is very central to our research project to say then, okay, here's a social movement that understands itself as a social movement. Is it now the case that there are tensions emerging once it's self-reflectively realizing its civil religious potentiality, or is this something that can become another motor, another motivating factor, another level of self-transcendence? But as I said, I would like to be very much interested to hear from Jannick about this. But very briefly, coming back to what you just discussed, there has often been the criticism leveled against the Pride movement that it's culturally sectarian, that it's a lifestyle sect celebrating itself and drowning out other voices and taking over public spaces. But what Sine just mentioned, that it's actually going back to its own foundation and therefore beginning to draw new groups back inside itself, shows you quite clearly, I think, that it's overcoming its perhaps initially sectarian characteristics and in theoretical term becoming more Catholic. Catholic simply means the reason why we call the Catholic Church Catholic, it means all-encompassing. Universal, right? So there is a movement. Normally in the sociology of religion, we worry about religions descending into sectarianism. Here we see it the other way around. Yeah? But the question this is an important question you're asking. Yeah?
Yeah. And I think it's, I mean, you can observe the tensions every year during Pride Week and also up to and afterwards in debates about corporations taking part in Pride parades. And you also have in discussions around commercialization, you now see that we have, I don't know if a counter Pride is the correct term for it, but you have Nørholm Pride, for instance. Yes, it's going on in parallel with Copenhagen Pride, and proclaimed anti-capitalist, for instance, whereas Copenhagen Pride, as I see it, try to kind of invite in organizations, and if you observe out there that, well, Netto is selling merchandise with the rainbow colors and so on, then you say, well, we can see that you're already kind of embracing our values. Why don't you become an official sponsor? So I think it's possible to observe some tensions, and increasingly so, because there are more and more organizations that also on social media in particular, which is also something that we have an eye out for, that want to kind of tap into the authenticity of Pride, because it's so visible, it's so out there. So if you want as an organization to kind of send a signal to the outside world that we actually a workplace that values these and these values, then this is a way around it. But then, of course, you make yourself a target because you step right into a values debate. It's political. Then you make yourself target of criticism if you actually don't live up to those values, if you don't live and breathe them the rest of the year. You might walk them one day in August, but you have to also live and breathe them for the rest of the year. So the tensions are definitely there, and I think an ambition of the project is to see if you can kind of move beyond this pinkwashing commercialization debate and say, so how can organizations, and especially for-profit organizations that kind of profit from Pride, how can they engage with LGBTQ plus activists and communities in a way that is meaningful for all parties?
When I asked about the consequences, I was actually thinking more in terms of, are we developing a clerisy, for example? Or is initiatives like Nørholm Pride a signal that we're also developing a sort of purist orthodoxy within our civic religion that in terms either breaks us up or have people preaching a certain version of the truth that they can or we can use against each other?
Well, you could say that it's a wonder that the movement has even managed to become as broad as it has, and to be able to, well, we can just look at the acronyms, and so from the L to the G to the T to the B to the I to the A to the Q to the plus. Right. So that in itself is sort of, and of course you could ask, is that possible? Can we just add more and more, and the more we add, the broader we become? Or do we have to sort of consider, well, what are the individual interests of each of the letters or each of the subcultures or even sects? So on the one hand, you've got that universalizing Catholic movement, and then on the other hand, you have that sort of, well, but what is it that we actually have in common? Especially once you've obtained sort of basic rights, like beyond recognition, beyond partnership, beyond equal representation in the workplace and so on. Well, what about sort of very specific interests of female couples with children? How does that correlate with trans people's rights to hormones, or gay men's rights to PrEP, or any, like, how do those issues work together? They might not be in disagreement, but which ones do we prioritize? If we have to choose one, that would be impossible, right? So what do we do when faced with the possibility of having actual political influence? And that might mean we can't do everything at once. So what do we want to do first? That, I feel like I'm getting off on a tangent here. But so that might be one of the sort of internal consequences of this success. Now that we've achieved our most apparent common main goals, what are we to do with other goals, and how might we be able to keep the movement together? So within feminist circles, you would sort of have the slogan that there can be no feminism that isn't intersectional, and maybe there can't be a pride that isn't intersectional. But what does that mean? How do we carry that out, and how do we perhaps maintain that universalizing momentum in statements like that?
Thoughts on clerisy and orthodoxy?
Yes, just to add to this, I think even if you don't want to go as far as analyzing the Pride movement as a civil religion, if you say, I don't want to do, with these Durkheimian or religious, semi-religious concept, and analyze it purely as a social movement, all social movements struggle at some stage of size with these internal strives. At the moment, we observe this with the Black Lives Matter movement, the concern that it's taken over by, in quotation marks, too many white people who then voice their concerns with police violence and anti-Trump. It's how black is Black Lives Matter? Is it black enough? That will always be there. But so I'm not so worried about this, to be perfectly honest. Something I'm worried and that I'm looking at the moment far more deeply, something I'm worried about much more, is the geopolitical tensions. So it is quite obvious that the universal and sacred elements that are embedded in the Pride movement are used by populist movements on the fringes of Europe to split up Europe as a political project. And vice versa, and there has been a lot of criticism about this, that for example organizations such as the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli army, uses the rainbow flag to promote its own openness, but at the same time is of course involved in illegal occupation. So the geopolitical consequences of the sacred and civil religious element, I think this is something that is far bigger than these questions about which column or which acronym will you add, and how do you balance concerns within the movement. That will come anyway.
Well, that's maybe a matter of whether you see yourself as sort of being positioned within the movement or observing it as an analytical phenomenon, because I'm certainly very concerned about what happens to the movement if it splinters, or how we could work with keeping it together. But I think you're right in pointing out that there's also that strategic use of homonationalism in the case of Israel, but also so what do they call them in Poland? The LGBTI-free zones. So there's like a homophobic nationalism at the same time, which I guess kind of shows that sort of, so gay rights, let's call them that for short, is still a contested issue that can be used on either side of various political fences as something to sort of, from not just as, I'm a big bad corporation, but now I've got a rainbow, but also I'm a big bad fascist, yeah. But now I don't have a rainbow, yeah.
And
anyway.
this particular issue that you're raising is also something we discussed during Winter Pride, right? That perhaps this whole notion of thinking about pride parades as a civil religion comes from a very privileged place. And it's definitely conceived in Denmark, where we are privileged enough to see organizations actually taking an interest in the first place. And then we can start criticizing them for not doing it in the right way, and maybe doing things without us, even though we usually say nothing about us without us. But in other places, they are still fighting for this kind of mainstreaming and encouraging organizations to take an interest in pride in the first place.
I just want to remind everybody here that you are free to, or welcome to, raise your hand and ask questions, because it's not only a talk amongst us. So if you have anything that you want the panel to answer, please do. I just want to latch on to what you said, Stefan, about the geopolitical aspect of this, because isn't there also perhaps a colonial or a post-colonial aspect to this, where many religions have a missionary element to them, and in a way human rights or LGBTI rights as we coin them in our part of the world are very much developed in the Western Northern Hemisphere, and are now in a way exported to parts of the world that might have other answers to the same questions, solutions to the same challenges, but now it's perceived as if you don't if you don't vote through LGBTI rights in our framework of them, then you are in violation with human rights that are perceived as universal. But many parts of the world were not even at the table in 1948 when we developed the human rights. So is there a missionary and colonial element to this as well?
I think this is a very good point you're making. So there is, of course, a very curious overlap between the popularity of pride in specific countries and precisely these countries coming out of a more or less Lutheran historical development. Right? This can actually statistically be shown. So countries that used to be either in the Eastern Hemisphere Orthodox or in the Southern Sphere Catholic are much less prone, even the same countries, yeah, so even the same companies. So Unilever or any other, name any other company in previously Lutheran countries will be very happy to tag on to pride. The same companies with the same brand names in other countries will be far more reluctant. And the argument has been made indeed before that Western liberal democracy used to be an export product was that channeled capitalist investment interest into the developing world. You cannot, or you just don't do that any longer. So it's under the disguise of the human rights agenda. And as you say, if you don't perform on these points, then maybe development aid will be cancelled to you because you're not performing to our standards. This is a concern specifically in countries in Asia where Western binary gender concepts didn't exist in the first place. So there might be people there saying, you're importing a problem that we never had in the first place. Yeah, I'm looking specifically here to countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, where third genders, fourth genders always existed. And it was the British and the French colonialists that were puzzled how you can have a third gender or no genders at all. Right? So there is I predict, and our group is part of this, that I think in future there will be more research going into this kind of post-colonial self-critique, if you like.
Yeah, I just think that this is a very interesting and very difficult problem, because I think the risk that we're running if we're like, oh, but human rights are Western and we might have to be very careful, and also some cultures had subcultures that were more or less recognized, but were recognized in very particular ways. And I think the sort of drive would be for many people today in those countries that you mentioned to want to experience the possibility of not just being a subculture, but being generally recognized as like on equal terms, like that they and their partner would be the same as every other couple or constellation of people loving each other in that place. So I think there's a sort of, okay, on the one hand, we shouldn't assume that this takes one particular form, but we should assume that the imperative to protect individual diversity and the ways in which people would like to live their lives in as much plurality as possible is, at least I find it hard to contest that principle. And I think that's kind of what to me is appealing about the notion of civic religion, that it sort of encapsulates that inviolable right of the individual to their self-expression. And of course, that immediately takes us back into issues of structural inequality and how do you know whether you're able to express yourself freely or not. But that's that's what we have to support and try and promote in the Pride movement and in our research, insofar as I can speak for any other normative position than my own within this project.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I see queer feminist theory, which to me is part of the Pride movement also, as really an extension of the Enlightenment period idea of the individual as well, all of us being created equal, basically. But only that queer theory actually kind of captures the fact that no, that is not the case yet. So it's trying to break down the binaries that create these social structures of inequalities and so on. So it is neutral in the sense that the kind of end of queer theory, so on, or to queer things, queer organization, queer societies and so on, is to end up with all individuals being equal, enjoying the same rights, etc., etc. So in that sense, I would actually say it's neutral. But then again, the different concepts like LGBTQ+ and so on are to me not created just to describe the world as it is. They also created to performatively kind of create the world as it can be. And in that sense, I think it's very important in other places around the world that they actually find back to some roots, some first people narratives and stories, ideas of how you can identify, because that might actually make more sense and be more meaningful to people locally. And I know from attending different conferences around the world that there are also researchers, among others in India, focusing on this, where they of course debate whether to use this acronym or to use some of their own vocabulary in order to kind of empowering the movement. And yeah, instead of being oppressed, you become empowered. Instead of asking for rights, you demand rights.
if we look at what you just said and what you also touched upon, Sine and Stefan, with bringing in the world from a more global perspective into this, and we still have this creation myth. I mean, we often laugh at it in Denmark because our national LGBT organization had their 20th anniversary before Stonewall even happened. So our movement did not start at Stonewall, and probably it started way before even LGBT plus Denmark. But will our movement be able to sustain the creation of alternative creation myths in other parts of the world, so that the Chinese movement, for example, says that, oh, but I don't know where that would be. I'm just giving a random example. We began at Tiananmen Square in 1989, and in India they will say, oh, but the whatever. So will that break us apart? Or will a religion, let's call it a religion now, will a religion be able to survive alternative myths?
I'm actually quite sure it does. It will, because if you look in, if you generalize from Pride as a movement and move over to what I would call Western liberalism as a civil religion, and if you wonder how is liberalism, constitutional government, a civil religion, just as one example, in the German Constitution from 1949, the first sentence that gives meaning to the entire Constitution actually says that the honor of the Würde, yeah, the value or the honor of the human being is untouchable. Yeah, so untouchable means sacred. It's not to be sullied. It's not to be touched. It has to be protected above all and against anything else. So, but this wider idea of Western liberalism, of course, stands not just on foundation myths of the French Revolution or the American Revolution. It has, in specific places, national foundation myths, national narratives, national, what I would call chronotopes, time spaces that matter to people in that particular locality or nation, but still links itself to a wider global movement that's 200-300 years old, which we call liberalism. And I see the same thing happening here. So I don't think that there's necessarily a contradiction.
I think it kind of ties to the question of whether the movement, and we've talked about it as the Pride movement today, and of course some people might say, well, that's not a very accurate term. Pride is this particular ritual within the broader movement. But I think the question of whether this movement is really hinges upon Pride and upon the public spectacle and upon the gathering of a mass of bodies in physical space is very interesting, particularly in these times. Like, what does it mean to the movement that this is the event that we have this year? And does it lessen the momentum, or does it mean that we realize that we can do without Pride, which of course would be sad? I don't think that's where we're going. So there's a kind of, on the one hand, what does Pride mean to this movement that exists, and might it be sort of challenged by current events? And then on the other hand, the question that you actually asked is, how can we make room for alternative manifestations? And I think those alternatives, if you want to tell a foundation myth of, in the beginning there was the Two-Spirit and the Two-Spirit created the world, I think that's perfectly feasible within the broader story. But if the broader story is threatened by pandemics or homophobic nationalist backlashes or whatever, that would maybe be more problematic. So I think we're entering really interesting times in terms of what happens this year mean for the future of the movement.
In many aspects, you just took the last question out of my mouth, because I was going to end this by asking what will be the long-term consequences of having, for us, a Pride without a march, but in many places, no Pride at all this year, for the first time in 50 years. So instead of asking that, because you've already almost answered it. I would like to, as my last question, ask, you're now conducting this research. Can you tell us a little bit about how do you do it? Where do you find your answers? How long is this project going to run for? When can we expect sort of conclusive answers on this? Is there a timeline for the project?
Yes, the timeline is 3 years. Yes, so by 2023 we should be able to provide some answers at least, even though they're not absolute in any sense, I would say. I think it's a weakness of our trade that we tend to ask more questions than we actually answer, but nonetheless we try. We will apply multi-methods, basically meaning that I will do interviews, for instance. I'm happy to follow Copenhagen 2021 organizing World Pride. World Pride is kind of the main case. We wanted to do a pilot study of Copenhagen Pride Parade this year, but given that it's changed, we now also have to reconsider that. But that just means really that maybe we can take a COVID-19 angle to it and look into the importance of body politics, of crowds coming together, what Judith Butler would call the performativity of assembling, of taking space, living and breathing, and without really saying anything, say that we have a right to be here. So this kind of concerted action, I think the fact that you've decided to, in spite of COVID-19 restrictions, to have some sort of manifestation of pride shows to it that it is necessary to meet somehow, physically also. So interviews, participant observation, walking as part of the Pride Parade, videographies to be able to document these kind of self-transformations that happen between representatives from organizations and the LGBTQIA+ activist communities. It is what we would call an effective ethnography, given that what we want to look into is also kind of the atmosphere, the mood, the feelings that are created, because I think what you can observe, and I say this from my experience with Roskilde Festival, they talk about an orange feeling, but I think there is definitely also some feeling to the Pride Parade, but we would really like to have people add words to that feeling, and that is part of an effective ethnography.
Could I just add about the COVID-19 crack in the timeline? I also wouldn't worry so much. Social movement studies and research has shown that once social movements have reached this type of level, they're surprisingly resilient and surprisingly agile. So if you look, for example, at the carnival in northern Italy and in western Germany, in Cologne, etc., etc., carnival didn't take place during the war. And also in the year Germany entered the Iraq War in 1991, the carnival didn't take place in Germany because people were worried. If you would have taken place last year in the carnival, you would not have noticed that there were cracks in the timeline. People forget very quickly, right? And as Jannick just told us exactly, so precise conclusions will be ready at 12 noon on the 30th of July 2023. But on that note, academics will never be able. We would lose our jobs. We will have to come out as at least as curious and stupid as we were. Otherwise, we would lose the raison d'être of academic research would go through the chimney, so to speak.
Sine, any final comments?
I think that was a very appropriate final comment, but I just wanted to add to this reassurance that 1 year's break will mean nothing, so we'll be back stronger, bigger, better in 2021 for the World Pride. Yay!
And if you want to know more about the project or just follow the project, cbs.dk/diversity, we will soon have a page up about the project.
And while I thank you all for coming, I just want to end this on another religious note by saying that if we had cancelled Pride, it would have been like cancelling Christmas. So we couldn't do that. I'm really happy for these insights. Thank you so much for doing the research also. It's super interesting, and I can't wait to read all the questions that you come up with. That will hopefully make us more knowledgeable about ourselves. And if any of you have an interest, please approach the people here before we finish here. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you to you all for coming as well. And happy Pride.